Hey everyone, it's Lindsay. I'm going to share with you today 2 ways to black heat emboss. So the first way, I'm using a Versamark ink pad. You can use a clear, sticky embossing ink pad, whatever is your choice, and also black embossing powder. Here's a closer look at that powder. Now I'm starting off with 2 pieces of cardstock here. I'm first going to heat emboss just the one on the right, and I'm prepping both pieces with my embossing bag. Now with the black embossing powder, you really want to make sure you use some kind of anti-static tool, whether it be a dryer sheet, your embossing pad, whatever you have on hand, make sure you use it with your embossing powder. So I inked up my stamp with Versamark ink and stamped it down onto my paper. And now I'm going to be using my black embossing powder, and I'm just going to dump it all out, not all of it, but dump a nice portion of it out over the stamped area. Just make sure it's nice and covered. And you can see it's going to get a little bit messy here, but that's okay. We'll just dump that out. And then I'm using my tweezers because if you get this on your fingers, it just creates a mess. So your tweezers are a really important tool when you're using this. So I tapped off all my excess here, and then I can funnel all the excess that's on that white piece of cardstock in the background back into the container. Now I'm also using a very soft, this is a watercolor brush. You can use whatever kind of brush you have on hand, but I'm using that to dust off any of the little stray powders. Now you're pretty much going to need a brush for the black embossing powder because it gets everywhere. So just make sure you have a brush on hand to dust off any of your little stray powders. Now I'm bringing in my heat tool. I've also got my tweezers holding onto that cardstock so I don't burn my fingers. And then I'm just going to melt this embossing powder until it's all nice and shiny. You can see in the video it melting, and always amazing to me. Once I know that it's all nice and melted, I am done and I have a nice black heat emboss stamped image. Now that is the first way, and you can see this is very nice. It's very dark black. It's great. But this is another way to do it, not quite as messy, but I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a pigment ink, and clear embossing powder. So again, I've prepped my cardstock with my embossing bag, just dusted that right over the surface. Now I'm going to ink up my stamp with the VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Now this is my favorite black pigment ink, but you could use any kind of black pigment ink you might have on hand. Just make sure it's nice and rich and black. I'll ink that up, make sure it's nice and covered with that ink, and then I'll firmly stamp it down onto the piece of white cardstock. Now I'm going to go ahead and place it right on top of that folded white cardstock. This just catches all of my extra embossing powder so I don't waste it and I can funnel it back into its container. I'll place that on there, open up my clear embossing powder. You can use any kind of clear embossing powder that you might have on hand, and just sprinkle that over the stamped surface. Now this is a pigment ink, so it's going to stay wet nice and long, so you don't have to worry too much about really hurrying. I'll pick that up and dust off any of the little excess that is attached around the card or around the cardstock, and then I can bring in my heat tool and melt all this powder that's on top of it. Now I'm going to show you the difference between the two once this really gets nice and melted on there. You can already tell a little bit that this is nice and shiny and black. However, the other one is shiny as well, but it doesn't have as much of a shine. You could see right there just how much of a shine that the clear embossing powder gives whenever you do heat embossing with it. Now the black embossing powder gives a little bit more of a matte finish, and it just is a little bit more messier, and it's not quite as black in my opinion, but the Versamark and the black embossing powder give you more of a matte finish, so it is just about what the end result you are looking for is, and also personal preference. Now you can find all the supplies that I've mentioned in this video listed over on my blog today. The link is in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for watching.